Today we're speaking with Emily, who is our Project and Client Liaison Officer for German Citizenship. The topic we're going to cover is one that we get lots of questions about, and that is where to find ancestral documents that you don't already have. Over to you, Eva.
Thank you, Stephanie. Emily, we're talking about documents, which can be a bit of a dry topic. However, one that's very, very important and one that people ask a lot of questions about. So typically, I would think that people will come to us with either nothing or everything and somewhere in between in terms of documentation proving their ancestry. So today we're going to be covering a scenario where someone doesn't have anything. Where do you get ancestral documents from, and how do you go about it?
So if your ancestors were born in Germany or died in Germany or were married in Germany, you need to know where in Germany they were living or were born or were married. So you have to go to different departments or different agencies that will then be able to tell you whether those documents exist where you think they exist.
Right.
It can be quite difficult because also a birth certificate is only held at the local registry for 100 years, and a marriage certificate 80 years, and a death certificate only for 30 years, and then you have to go to the state archive.
Okay, so what you're describing essentially is a system that's not necessarily centralized, and what we often explain to people is that there's not a database where you can type something in and information will pop up or documents will pop up. So if people don't have documents, the first thing we need to know is what documents are missing, where somebody comes from, because you do need to go to the locality that the event took place. So whether it's a birth, marriage, or death certificate, you do need to go directly to where that happened or where that document was registered. And thirdly, you need to know what period of time we're talking about, because depending on that, the documents might be at the local authority, or they might already be in the archives. So typically, what sort of documents would we be looking for to back up somebody's claim for German citizenship, Emily?
So usually we're looking for a birth certificate, marriage certificates, and death certificates. We can also be looking for registration of address. So things can also be found through the church registers. Also passports and IDs can be found in state archives. So anything to sort of prove German citizenship and your lineage is what's important.
Okay, and depending on what you might already have or where somebody comes from, the journey to acquiring those documents might vary, because we would need to look at your family history, who the documents are about, who are they for, when were they created, because obviously Germany's borders also shifted, so sometimes those documents might not even be in Germany, right?
Yeah, that can happen. You can have to look in Poland or the Ukraine sometimes too.
Or even Austria or whatever it is, because, particularly after the war, the borders shifted quite dramatically. And in terms of success rates of finding documents, generally speaking, typically, can we find things on people in Germany?
Usually you can. If you roughly know where they're from, it's quite easy to search multiple authorities at a time, but you kind of need to know a rough area that they're from, although many are digitalizing at the moment, so hopefully in the future it'll be easier.
Right. So the way that you described it sounds relatively simple, but I think it's very far from simple, because once we understand your family history, if we can understand it, we can approach the German archives or local authorities and ask for those documents. But more often than not, we're starting with very little. So, if we're going back 100 years, many people know very little about their family history or where they're from, or how do we get that information together? How do you elicit that to be able to apply if somebody's starting from nothing?
Usually you have a name. Germans have family books which are registered. So if you have some names in your family, you can usually find the family book and then work through from there. So the family book has birth certificates in it. from all family members, and the Germans were very good at keeping them. So that's usually a really good place to start.
And the other thing I just wanted to add here briefly is that we might use secondary documents, so documents that are created, let's say in America or Australia, wherever the family immigrated to be able to work out where somebody comes from, what their original name was. So we start with that, and we might start with your birth certificate actually, because people don't think of it. What does your birth certificate says? And sometimes we find in people's birth certificates a lot of surprises. You know, because who looks at their birth certificate, right? The only time you would is if you, you know, apply for a passport or something. And I think that would be a starting point. If you don't know anything about your family history, start with your birth certificate. The other thing that I suggest for people to do is apply for death certificates for family members, or birth certificate and marriage certificates for family members that have immigrated, because any documents that were created outside of Germany can give you a lot of clues into what's in Germany. Sometimes, however, it can confuse you even more because people just, you know, didn't pay a lot of attention, I guess, to when those documents were created. But we often read between the lines, and sometimes something like a photo or a back of a photo or a secondary document can really help us guide our research in where to look in Germany and what form, right? All right, so in terms of what we would be suggesting for someone that doesn't have any documentation is this: start with your own document, start with your birth certificate, see what it says. What is your mother's name? What is your father's name on it? If your parents were married, have a look at their marriage certificate. Again, they might, you know, those documents might contain information that you don't even know about, and then go up in that family tree to see what else you can gather. What about Australian archives or American archives? Are they useful to be able to shape the research journey for our clients?
Most of the time, they're hugely useful to us. Sometimes people have claimed different citizenships on their documents, but it still gives us a really good indication of where they came from. So,
the one that I get a lot of is after the war, there were several millions of people that were displaced in Germany, and they may have happened to be born in Germany, but they do not hold German citizenship because it's through law of blood. So whether they come from Romania or Poland, Lithuania, just being born in Germany is not the same as holding German citizenship. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Right. So again, we would look at all the documents you have and try and put a decent family tree together, because it not only goes to your eligibility, we need to understand, you know, dates of birth, places of birth, immigration dates, what year somebody's naturalized, but we also look at content of various documentation. And like I said, it may be a photo, it may be a letter, it may be an envelope with somebody's address. All of those bits of information help. All right, so let's now move on to Stephanie and a couple of questions that we might have.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a question from Eliza. She says, how long will it take to acquire all documentation, and what language do documents need to be submitted to the embassy in?
Stephanie, is it fair, Stephanie? Emily, is it fair to say that German archives are pretty efficient?
They are pretty efficient. They'll let you know first whether that document exists, and then you can request it.
And some documentation we would not be able to acquire because of privacy. Could you just briefly explain to us how that works in Germany?
You can acquire documents of direct relatives in Germany if they've passed away. If they're still alive, you need special permission from most archives to gather that information.
Okay, so depending on how old the documents are and who you are in relation to the people we are applying, there are pretty strict privacy regulations in Germany and all across Europe. So sometimes you need to prove what we call kinship or legal interest as to why you're applying for this documentation, and we need to know whether the person concerned is still alive or not. And also where this documentation is kept. So if it's local authorities versus archives, the process of getting them might vary. But generally speaking, I think under 3 months, would you say that it's about the right amount of time that it takes something to arrive?
Definitely, unless it's a very obscure document, you should definitely be able to get it with under 3 months.
And Emily, in terms of the language or languages that firstly these documents are issued in, and secondly the German government would require once the application for German citizenship is filed, what are they?
So these documents, you have to submit the original copy that you get from the archives, which are duplicates basically of the original. So if you want to keep some for yourself, I would get 2 copies because the German government doesn't like returning documents. They will not have to be translated because all documents have to be submitted with a German translation if they are not in German. So your own birth certificate, if you're born in Australia or America or Canada, will have to be translated into German, and all other documentation will, unless it is already in German, of course.
German, right. And the other interesting thing I should just mention as we're wrapping up is that because Germany is part of the European Union, there is a system of multilingual documents. So the original, by the way, the original book of births, let's say, which were, these books were kept in handwritten format. That stays with the registry office. What they will give you is a copy which is certified or stamped by the archive or whatever the authority that issues it. But they can also issue a printout of key information in, I think, 27 different languages. So the content will be German, but the description of what's in it will be in other languages. The thing with those books of births or marriages or deaths is that they often have lots of very useful information sort of on the margins, so we can tell a lot from our original document. So normally we would request that document, but if you want a multilingual version, you can also request that as well.
Exactly.
All right. Well, Stephanie, over to you. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Any other questions or anything else that we want to cover?
No, thank you so much, Emily and Eva. We'll be wrapping up the session. Just a quick reminder to everyone listening to get in touch with us if you have any questions, and also check out our social media channels as we post a lot of useful information about German citizenship. Thank you again.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Stephanie.